afternoon and welcome to the first FSC Connect webinar for Q4. Today, the FSC is delighted to welcome Alex Tan as our special guest speaker on the very impactful topic, Modern Risks of Investing, Xinjiang, Modern Slavery and ESG Concerns, with a focus on the S or social element of ESG. Our guest today, Alex Tan, is a partner with PwC based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He is currently the Regional Risk and Forensics Leader for PwC's Southeast Asia Consulting. Prior to moving to Kuala Lumpur in early 2012, Alex spent 7 years with PwC New Zealand, and before that 8 years with the New Zealand Serious Fraud Office. In his current role, Alex has responsibility for dealing with matters related to forced labour. In the last few years, Alex has undertaken forced labour-related engagements on behalf of a number of large multinational and regional companies in sectors as diverse as electronics, palm oil, rubber gloves, whiteware, garments, and consumer goods. He has also provided training to boards of banks on the implications of forced labour on their businesses. Please use the chat function throughout the session to ask any questions, and we will look to ask them during or following Alex's presentation. But I will start off with asking you, Alex, what is modern slavery? And more specifically, forced labour? Why is this important to New Zealand businesses and investors?
Morning or afternoon, Carissa, from sunny Kuala Lumpur. I've prepared a slide deck here. I think we'll answer a lot of those questions in the slide deck if we just crack on. But pleasure talking to everybody, and some people on the call I think I know, and those that I don't, pleased to virtually meet you. Hopefully the weather's good in New Zealand. I'm back there next week to see the folks. So please get the sun out for me. So what do I want to share today is, just provide everybody on the call here with an overview of the issue around forced labor. It is a complex area, a really complex area, but I'll try and keep it simple. Previously, what people have treated it as an HR issue or a sustainability issue. Once we get a bit into this discussion, and we'll see the enforcement action taken by the US government and other governments around the world, it's actually a risk and compliance issue. And for too long, the rights holders, which are the workers, have not been in the front of business decisions. There are risks to the audience today and the companies that you represent in terms around your investment, lending decisions, etc. Feel free along the way to ask any questions in the chat box and challenge me if you want to. So coming back to your question, Carissa, what is forced labor? So the ILO, which is the International Labour Organization, has this definition. Being a United Nations body, they don't come up with definitions easily. So they probably go through about 1,000 committees and that. So it comes up with this definition, which in many ways is helpful, in many ways is not helpful. So it's all work or service which is exacted from any person under threat of a penalty for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. And they think about that voluntarily side, but well, is this some sort of slavery? Well, no, they may offer themselves up voluntarily for work, but if they'd known the true conditions of it, would not have worked. And when you think a threat of penalty, it may not be an overt penalty, but it may be a vicarious penalty for which I was just reading today online about in New Zealand, a manager of a McDonald's has been found to be putting his people into some of his workers into potential forced labor issues, whereby if they resigned from the 4 McDonald's that he was operating in New Zealand, they had to pay back a $3,000 bond or pay a $3,000 penalty. Well, that was a penalty that was imposed if they left. They weren't in danger of it at the time, but if they left, they were in danger. So this is a very broad definition, and they've further defined it as part of modern slavery, right? So we look at what is modern slavery versus forced labor, and again using the ILO, the International Labour Organization. So you have modern slavery is forced labor and forced marriage, okay? And forced labor breaks down into privately imposed forced labor. We have the example of the McDonald's in New Zealand, or state-imposed forced labor. We have issues around which I'll cover Xinjiang province in China, use of prison labor, and so forth. And under privately imposed forced labor, you have forced labor exploitation and also forced commercial sexual exploitation. So the areas I do want to cover is this bit that's more prominent: the forced labor, privately imposed, state imposed, and forced labor exploitation. So coming back to that definition, which is helpful and not helpful, the International Labour Organization has come up with 11 indicators of forced labor. It's pretty easy to understand these forces. They have a document which you can readily download. But the 11 areas of forced labor, the 11 indicators, are abuse of vulnerability, so a lot of potentially migrant refugee workers in this region, deception, and that happened, if we put it into the New Zealand context, around the fishing industry in the South Island, where you had a lot of migrant workers come in from Southeast Asia, from Thailand, Vietnam, wherever, Philippines, who one thought they were going to be maybe, say, working in the fields picking blueberries and strawberries, and next minute found themselves rolling around a fishing boat off the South Island, or else they think they're going to be a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant and end up working long hours under the sun in, say, Australia, picking fruit, etc. Restriction of movement, we have that like here in Malaysia, where they say, yeah, look, you can go out, but you can't go more than a kilometer from the worker accommodation. You don't need to, because we've got all the shops you need here, etc., etc. So that restriction movement, or just even keeping them within the factories or the warehouses. Isolation, that's particularly prominent with palm oil plantations. A lot of palm oil plantations are, hundreds of kilometers away from towns and cities, etc., and they're isolated from any outside contact on these palm oil plantations in the middle of nowhere. Physical and sexual violence, that's self-explanatory. Intimidation and threats, especially migrant workers with their families back home. If you don't stay here and work, we'll get the recruiting agent back in your home country to pay a visit to your families and that. Retention of identity documents, especially in Southeast Asia, you need identity cards, etc., to move around, and you get stopped. So they hold on to those, and a lot of the companies that got hit with sanctions by the US government, what they call, and I'll cover this off later, the WRO withholding release orders, were because they were holding workers' passports and they weren't providing them lockers for the passports, so the workers couldn't run away. It's a safety mechanism for the company to stop workers running away, etc. Withholding of wages, that's reasonably common in this part of the area, and also, it's not just Southeast Asia. If you look at the garment industry in Leicester in England, the workers are given two pay slips. One is the minimum wage to show the tax authorities and any other authorities, and one is the real wage, which is a lot lower than the minimum wage. Debt bondage, this is a major issue, and we'll cover a bit of that later, which is essentially the payment of recruiting fees. They pay huge amounts, so put themselves in debt and their families to get on a plane to go to another country to work. Abusive working and living conditions, again, reasonably self-explanatory. In Malaysia, we have a piece of legislation which is minimum housing standards for workers, and a lot of them don't comply with that. We're just finishing we're writing the report for one of the world's top whiteware manufacturers, a Western company, and the living conditions were pretty terrible. If head office back in the home country saw this, they would be pretty shocked. And excessive overtime, and they caveat that by saying, as long as you hit you're below any legislative overtime limits, then that's fine. In Malaysia, it's 104 hours a month. You cannot do more than 104 hours overtime a month for workers, even if all parties consent. So if the worker consents and the and the company consents, you still cannot exceed 104 hours. We've just finished a piece of work. I can name them. They've allowed consent. So it's a company called VS Industry, who is a supplier to Dyson. They make the Dyson hair dryers and vacuum cleaners and so forth. They had some very isolated cases. It was not systemic, and it slipped under the radar, and management was shocked when they found out. But they had they had half a dozen cases of people working 3 to 4 months without a leave day, voluntarily, because they wanted the overtime. But they wanted the overtime because they were, they came from poor families in Bangladesh and Nepal. So some companies like Top Glove, the world's largest glove manufacturer based in Kuala Lumpur, they've imposed IT-related controls that prevents workers from working more than 6 days without a break. So the normal standard in Southeast Asia or in Malaysia is you work 6 days, you have a day off. So Top Glove have mandated that you cannot miss your leave day. That was their response to sanctions from the US government. Other companies, some palm oil companies have said you can't go more than 13 days. So you can have one day where you work your leave day and get paid for it, but you can't do that more than 2 weeks in advance. But other companies, they just keep them working on and on. So what is the scale of the issue here? So this is again taken from a recently released, it only came out in the last month or two, report from the International Labour Organization. I put the acknowledgement at the bottom there. You can download the report. So the ILO estimates the number of people in forced labor has increased to 27.5 million from about 25 million in 5 short years. Okay. If we have a look at where I sit and where the audience members sit, which is in Asia Pacific, that has the highest number, which is 15.1 million people estimated to be in conditions of forced labor. The Arab states, in terms of a percentage of population, have the highest prevalence. But if we look at it from a New Zealand business point of view, an investment point of view, banking, fund management, etc., we have strong relationships with the wider Asia Pacific region and the Gulf states as well. So this is a problem in terms of who you're doing business with or who your customers are doing business with. Obviously, migrant and refugee workers are the most vulnerable. And in Malaysia, we have, I think, 2 to 3 million migrant workers from overseas doing a lot of the manufacturing, palm oil, etc., primarily from Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nepal. If we look at someone like Panasonic air conditioning, 80% of Panasonic air conditioners globally are made in Malaysia, and Panasonic has air conditioning in Kuala Lumpur. Their factory here has 6,000 workers from Nepal. So that's the size of, I'm not saying they've put in conditions of forced labor, I'm just telling you the size of the issue and the number of workers here. In Indonesia, they don't have foreign workers coming in, but they have a lot of internal migrant workers from various parts of Indonesia. You look at Thailand, you get people from Laos, you get the Rohingya refugees coming out of Myanmar, etc. So into Thailand. So a lot of the fishing industry and the manufacturing industry. Vietnam, you have a little bit of a migrant worker coming in, but a lot of it is mainly internal. So if we look at, you see the size of it, north of Hanoi, Samsung has its largest factory. I think they've got about 50,000 workers or something like that. Most of those are Vietnamese. They may not be from overseas countries, but they may be internal migrants. So they get treated, internal migration, you're away from home, you're hundreds of miles away, you're staying in hostels, etc. So the potential for abuse is significant. So what are we seeing? So if we look at, this is from the work that we're doing here with our clients. Down the bottom in dotted line, with the boxes of dotted line, that is applicable to both local and migrant workers. The bits without the dotted box around it, is mainly applicable to foreign workers. So we start at the top left then. Undocumented migrants, we over the lockdown, and I'll talk about Malaysia, but it's the same for other countries that import labor in this region. They didn't have enough documented workers for filling factories, warehouses, manufacturing palm oil plantations. So we have a number of undocumented migrants. So we work very closely with a woman by the name of Leva, who's a human rights and labor rights consultant, does a lot of work with workers in plantations. And we were doing some work with her about 2 weeks ago, and she dropped in to fill up her car at the petrol station, and it's a national petrol station here. And within 3 minutes of talking to the petrol pump attendant, she discovered he was an undocumented migrant worker. He'd been smuggled here on a boat. Somebody who had complained about the conditions on the boat was just thrown overboard. And that's, so why would he complain? Or the fear that, he would have in his mind about complaining. So he's just there on the petrol pump, pumping gas. But Lever's worked so much with migrant workers, she can talk to them in their own language and so forth. So high recruitment fees, we'll talk about recruitment fees in a slide or two time. False promises of terms and conditions, you're going to work 5 days a week, you're going to have air-conditioned rooms and your own rooms, etc., etc. Minimal overtime. That a lot of that goes out the window. We did some work a couple of years ago for an American company that owned a factory here, a household name, manufacturing, and the workers were made to work 48 hours straight with no paid overtime, and then they'd make the workers team up with a buddy, whether you like that person or not, and if that person ran away, you got because of the conditions, you got penalized financially. And when you're on very low wages, it impacts you. But why should you get penalized if this person who you've just been allocated to decides to run away because they're not happy with the conditions? And that was an American company. Withholding of wages into debt bondage. Living conditions not in line with workers' minimum standards. Act 446, that's just called here the minimum housing limit, which sets aside, how much space there must be between beds, how many people in a room, how many toilets per room, etc., etc. Excessive overtime, obviously abusive and detrimental to workers' health and well-being. Employment of minors, this has been a big issue, and we get a lot of discussion about this, is, to what extent is plantations and factories using child labor versus, particularly on plantations where the whole family lives there, after school, the child helping out dad around the plantation, just like in New Zealand, you'd get the son or daughter at 10 or 12 helping dad on the farm. So there's a bone of contention here which has been raised as to whether that is child labor or not in some instances. Isolation, which is particularly prominent, as I mentioned, on palm oil plantations, fishing vessels and the fishing industry, abusive work environment, intimidation and threats. What happens here, I'll use the palm oil because they've been under the spotlight. The managers there, or the supervisors, are called mandors, and mandors normally come from the workers, right? So you've been a worker, you've been there 15, 20 years, you've come, you're trusted, so they make you a mandor, it's like a promotion. Well, a lot of these mandors, they started 15, 20 years ago, and when the conditions were even worse. They don't get taught soft skills. So they treat the workers how they were brought up to be treated. And so you have a lot of issues. And also in normal factories, the whiteware factories, the rubber glove factories, etc., where you get people promoted up from the ranks. The company invests very little around soft skills, coaching, all the rest of it. They just say, next month, Alex, you're the supervisor from next week. And it means a lot in terms of money and that. So there's the way they treat the workers under them can lead to some fairly abusive conditions. Retention of identity documents, I spoke about that. So and this is public information. So some of the palm oil companies, they weren't providing secure lockers for their workers, so the workers were having to hand over their passports for safekeeping in that. And so I think it's Sime Darby Plantations now just gone and invested. This is the size of the operation. I think they've put in 40,000 lockers for their workers. That's the number of workers they've got. It's a small city in New Zealand, 40,000. And it's actually in Malaysia against the law to withhold someone's passport without just cause, and that it's a 5-year jail term. But we see it all around. People in this part of the world, they have domestic helpers, maids from the Philippines or Indonesia, whatever, and they hold their passport without to prevent them running away, etc. And it basically forces the person to work for you, and they can't. If you're a Bangladeshi or Cambodian worker in a plantation in the middle of nowhere and you don't like the conditions you're working in, how do you leave if you haven't got your passport, right? As soon as you leave, you're an undocumented illegal immigrant. Your family owes thousands to loan sharks or whatever, a page away, etc. So it's a vicious cycle they're put in. If you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box or ask later. So what we talked about debt bondage. So debt bondage risks are really real. I'll use the Malaysian example, but it's all throughout, the Arab states and this part. So in Malaysia, the minimum wage is just risen. It's actually risen quite a lot. It's gone up about 30% in the last year, the minimum wage, but it's still low by New Zealand comparative standards. Okay, so the minimum wage in Malaysia is 570 New Zealand dollars a month. Okay, so what about people who have to pay some sort of fee? When we do our interviews with workers, and the way we approach it is we do hundreds of interviews. So that company that supplied Dyson, VS Industry, we interviewed over 300 workers, right? So we can get a feel when they say, look, I've paid this amount or paid this amount. By country, the amount that they spend varies, okay? So you put that in your mind, 570 a month is the minimum wage in Malaysia. So here's what they're paying typically in recruiting fees. So Nepalese will pay, 1,900 to 2,500 around there. But if you move all the way to the right, Bangladeshi workers are paying on average nearly 7,000 to 8,500. Well, let's just have a look at this. You're a worker from Bangladesh. You're getting paid the minimum wage, which is 570. Let's just say you make $700 because there's overtime. They get paid overtime, right? You take out of there $20 or $30 for your accommodation, if they're all doing it properly, if the company's doing it properly, plus internet and all the rest. And there may be, say, $50 in total taken out of your salary for various deductions. That leaves, say, $650, okay, of which you've got to spend, say, 100, 150 for your food and all the rest of it. So that takes you down to $500. You then got to send that back home to your family. Let's just say you're sending $500 back to your family in Bangladesh, who have to live on that. They're relying on you. So, but they've borrowed, let's just take the middle ground, 7,500 from a loan shark or from their neighbors or from their family and friends, etc. How long does it take them to repay that debt, which puts you into debt bondage? So what the government of Malaysia has done is, from 2017, they've entered into a lot of agreements with other countries around the world that there will be no recruiting fees paid by workers. Okay, it's paid by the company that is employing you, which is fair. So, but what happened was a lot of the companies had recruiting agents in, Indonesia or Bangladesh or Nepal, and they would subcontract and they would have sub-agents who'd go out into the villages, and that's where the real risk was. Okay, now some companies like Top Glove, VS Industry, the Dyson supply and that, they're all deciding they're going to just use one recruiting agent. They send their own people over there doing recruiting time. They make sure they interview the workers to make sure they haven't paid any recruiting fees. Okay, but this is where geopolitics and a little bit of racism takes place. So this is the situation here. And when they do pay the recruiting fees or fee for the visa, whatever, the US government and other agencies and NGOs class that as putting them into debt bondage. Well, let's have a look at the UK. So the UK is struggling at the moment with workers for their fruit picking for strawberry because of Brexit, etc. If you do a Google search on that, the BBC, they do some interviews and they're saying, yep, of course, we were trying to get in some workers from Nepal to come into our fields and pick strawberries, etc., etc. Of course, they've got to pay the £450 for their visa stamping and all the rest of it. So hang on, why is it okay that the UK charges Nepalese workers for their visa and travel expenses, which puts them in, but in coming into Southeast Asia, you can't. It's just because you're going to the UK, maybe a higher minimum wage and all the rest of it, but to come up with £450 in Nepal is still a lot of money for them and puts them into debt bondage. So there's a little bit of a disconnect on how Western countries are being treated versus how Asian countries. I'm not saying Asian countries are being disproportionately, at disadvantage. No, there should be no recruiting fees paid, right? The stance taken in Malaysia and other countries in Southeast Asia is the correct one. But why is it that in the UK no one's kicking up a fuss about it? You're still putting them into debt bondage. Maybe they can repay it faster, and some of the conditions may not be perfect in the UK either. You come to Malaysia and it's hot and humid and that. Well, I can't imagine working in the fields in the middle of January in the UK is going to be any more pleasant. And the UK has a number of issues as well. So the clothing industry, as I mentioned in Leicester, with Boohoo and all the rest of which supplies Marks and Spencers and that, that's rife with forced labor. And actually there's a complaint gone in by a guy by the name of Duncan Jepson from Liberty Shared, who's an NGO. He's made a complaint to the US authorities, US Customs, about sanctioning some of the UK garment industry. So this is a big problem. So the company, just telling you about how some of the companies are addressing it. So VS Industry, the Dyson supplier, they were fantastic when we dealt with them. So they had identified everybody from 2017 onwards who had paid recruiting fees and repaid them. But when we went in, we said, well, hang on, 2017 may be the cutoff year, but what about the people that are in your workforce who joined prior to 2017? So we did a piece of work and we identified a number of these workers, and we turned out, and using the figures based on what you can see, obviously they don't have paperwork, okay? If they're and I'm not being facetious here, they'll sell the family cow. In Bangladesh, a cow is worth a lot of money. They'll sell the family cow, they'll sell the house, they'll borrow from loan sharks, nobody has paperwork for this. So you have to go broadly by what we're seeing on the screen here. So if someone from Nepal says they paid 15,000 New Zealand dollars, the chances are it's probably not accurate. Okay, so based on what we're seeing, we came up with a number of the workers who had paid about, converting it to New Zealand dollars, probably close to half. It was about $500,000 in total, okay, for the workers. So we went to the board meeting and to the board chairman. It's a listed company, but it's still predominantly owned by a family. And the board chair said, what do we do about it, Alex? I said, we've got nobody from 2017 onwards who paid recruiting fees, but prior to that, we've got all this. What do we do? I said, well, pay them back. He goes, yeah, sure, we'll do that. He goes, is that enough? I said, well, if you pay them back what they paid, then that is, that would satisfy most people. I said, very few companies may add a small interest charge on that, just to say, we're very sorry, interest charge. And virtually nobody would also add a small ex gratia payment. So the chairman of the board just turned to the CFO and said, by next week, I want them all repaid. I want 2% compounding interest since the day they joined. And in New Zealand dollars, 35 bucks New Zealand dollars as an ex gratia, we're very sorry payment. So within 1 week, we had all these workers paid $500,000 plus interest compounding since the day they joined, and some of them have been there 8 to 10 years, plus $35 ex gratia payment. So that was a very good outcome for the workers, and the decision made immediately by the board chair. So the workers weren't expecting it. Next minute, some of them got thousands and thousands of dollars in their out of cycle from their pay, from their payroll and paid. So that was a good outcome. This
Alex,
piece of work, yeah.
I've got a question in the chat. Are relocation costs similar to fees that go to third-party recruiters?
Yeah. So the way it should work, relocation to let's say coming into Malaysia or coming into New Zealand, that should all be borne by the company. All costs established by recruiting, right? Whether it be the actual recruiting fee, to get you an interview or to get your visa or actually put you on the plane, should be borne by the company. Okay. So that's so coming back to that point, the piece of work we're doing with this global whiteware company, and I'm sure most people in the audience will have something from that company in their house. The worker has to go undergo health check, medical check, and all the rest of it. They stay for a day or two in Dakar or Kathmandu, and so the recruiter is given a lump sum per worker. Let's just call it $1,000. Here's $1,000. Here's your fee. Here's their fee for and to pay for the worker's health check and all the rest of it. Here's $1,000. Okay. What we've found out, and we've just finished this piece of work, is that the workers were going there. They didn't have to pay a recruiting fee, but they were made to pay their own health check, well, which may only be $50, right? But if you times it by thousands of workers, and it should have been paid by the recruiter just held on to the money from the company, and they did, and the company did not. And this is, like I said, most people on this webinar will have a product from that company in their kitchen, and the workers here are manufacturing the product for global consumption. Okay, global enforcement. So what is driving enforcement? As with most things globally, and apologies to anyone from America on here, it's the US, okay? And it's US Customs and Border Protections, USCBP, okay? So what they do is US Customs, if they believe that a product is made with indentured or forced labor, will block at the border any product from that company. And that's called a WRO, withhold release order. So when a product goes into America, it gets given a release order. So if you, I don't know, let's say from a New Zealand context, if Zespri's sending kiwi fruit into the US, it's subject to a release order, released into the US. If they believe that there's forced labor, it will stop it all at the border and be held in a bonded warehouse subject to a WRO, okay? So the WRO allows US Customs to detain goods at ports of entry. So the last 2 to 3 years, US Customs has been very, very rigorous at WROs. The bar to issue a WRO is very low. US Customs was in town about 3-4 months ago. I was chatting to them. They said they're an enforcement agency. They're not an advisory agency. So if they get a complaint, they'll do a little bit of investigation. If they believe there is any chance of forced labor, they'll issue a WRO. And basically they'll say to the company, and this is where those 11 indicators come into play. So download those 11 indicators, because US Customs benchmarks against the 11 indicators. They will say, we believe that one or more of the 11 indicators are present in your operations. You must now demonstrate to us that either those indicators no longer exist or they never existed. So you're almost proving a negative. And in many cases, they won't tell you which 11 are present. Some cases they do, but in some cases they just say some or all of the present. So you're basically left with a blank canvas. What do you do? From a reputational point of view, to have your product stopped or anything linked to your product stopped is a reputational issue, and it's also a financial issue. If then US Customs then go away and do a bit more investigation, if they find conclusive evidence of forced labor, they then issue a finding which allows them to seize the goods there. So let's take a case here. It's public, so we can talk about it. Sime Darby Plantation, the world's biggest palm oil producer. Malaysian company. They are subject of a WRO. So any product made with Sime Darby products cannot go into the US. So Ferrero Rocher chocolates, those things in the round things with the gold things, a small amount of that is made with Sime Darby products. So Ferrero Rocher's just said we're not going to use Sime Darby plantation product whatsoever. Okay, so anything with a touch point to Sime, it's not the Sime Darby palm oil doesn't have to be the main product, it just has to be a small component of it and it gets stopped. So they've now issued a finding, US Customs has issued a finding against Sime Darby. So now any of the product that was previously detained has now been seized. So currently, US Customs has 54 active WROs and 9 findings. Malaysia has the second highest number of WROs after China. Okay, so China has 35 with 5 findings. Malaysia has 6 active WROs with 1 finding. And Taiwanese operated fishing vessels has 5 WROs with 1. This is current. They said they're investigating some cases in Vietnam and Thailand. They obviously haven't come out with finding. They're obviously investigating the industry, apparel industry in Leicester as well. This is a big issue. Top Glove, the world's largest glove manufacturer, did have a WRO. Top Glove went all out to improve everything, and US Customs, and now they've been removed off the WRO list, and US Customs have said that Top Glove is a model on how to do this properly, but it costs them in New Zealand dollars, new accommodation, that's probably close to 100 million New Zealand dollars in repayment of fees, new accommodation, that maybe just over 100 million. So it's a huge amount of money, okay, that it's cost them. Plus, if you're the world's largest rubber glove manufacturer, you have a WRO in the middle of the pandemic. You think of the lost business, right? And there were a lot of people who invested into Top Glove shares, and that were questioning from an ethical point of view, what should they do with their shares? Should they keep, investment houses? And some of the Malaysian sovereign wealth funds and that were questioning should they do it. So the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. So this has just come in and it's extremely onerous and will impact everybody. So Uyghurs are that ethnic group in China. They're based primarily in the province of Xinjiang. So Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnic minority group. They're the ones that China's been accused of abusing. So if you look at it from a WRO perspective, they said that, if you recall, your goods are presumed to be clean until someone makes a complaint, US Customs investigates and then issues a WRO. With this act that came in June, any product coming out of Xinjiang province is presumed to be made with forced labor unless you can prove otherwise, and it's proved with clear and convincing evidence. I put it at the bottom there. That's their terminology. What is clear and convincing evidence? Okay, so anything that comes out of Xinjiang is deemed to, and anything made downstream with that. So it's like importation of any goods, wares, articles, merchandise, mined, produced, manufactured, wholly or partly in Xinjiang. Okay. So what is the implication here for New Zealand? 4 priority areas for the US government on Xinjiang product. Tomatoes and tomato products. Okay, you think, well, 40% of global tomato paste comes from China. Okay, so New Zealand obviously has its own agriculture, but what products are in New Zealand that's made with tomato paste from China? Are you funding any, are you loaning any money to companies who have tomato paste products, or are you investing into anything? Okay, cotton. 20% of the world's cotton is produced in Xinjiang. Okay, so when this law came in, the Vietnamese government was very concerned, and they sent a delegation to the US, because a lot of the manufacturing of apparel, of shirts and T-shirts, Adidas, Nike, and all the rest of it, has moved out of China into Vietnam for 2 reasons: the geopolitical issue between China and the US is one, but also China is becoming a first world country, so the cost of labor is actually quite high. So manufacturing is moving out. So a lot of the apparel industry and clothing is made out of Vietnam now, and if 20% of the world's cotton is produced in China, in Xinjiang, what is the impact for New Zealand? So New Zealand retail stores, etc., are bringing it in. What link do you have to Xinjiang? Apparel, which is largely a byproduct, and the other one they're looking at is polysilicon. 50% of the global polysilicon comes from Xinjiang. So what is polysilicon? It is one of the main components of solar panels, semiconductors, sealants, including for flooring. Okay, and New Zealand obviously has a solar panel industry. So the question there, are any of your investments or your customers linked to these industries? If so, what are the risks? Okay, this is a US Act, all right? This is a US Act, you're New Zealand. But what happens if you've invested into a company X, or you have a relationship with company X, or if you're a bank or something, you've got a loan with company X, and company X has been importing or dealing with any of these products, and they get subject to a WRO in America. Remember, it's immediate WRO if you're doing it, unless you can show otherwise. What is the reputational issue coming back to you? It may not be a financial issue initially, but what is the reputational issue there that you've invested into this? Because modern slavery, forced labor, is a dirty word. Okay, so if you've got an investment into a company that's subject to WRO from forced labor around the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, what are the issues? What I've just put on the screenshots on the right there, they're just some screenshots from YouTube, so you can learn a little bit more. There's lots of it there if you want to look at Uyghur abuse. There is also, if you want a very good documentary, if you want to learn about it, it's about Dyson. And if you do a search on YouTube for Dyson and forced labor or something like that, there was a company in Malaysia called ATA, and it's about a 20-minute documentary from the UK, where ATA was another company that was supplying Dyson with product, and they had a major forced labor issue, which people say that Dyson were too slow to act, but in the end, Dyson severed all ties with ATA, and ATA's virtually collapsed now. They were $1 billion market cap. They've virtually collapsed. They're trying to find new markets in China, etc. But most interestingly, a number of ATA migrant workers, Nepalese, who are based in Malaysia, are now suing Dyson in the UK by saying, you've made profits off the back of my forced labor. Okay, so that's an ongoing litigation case in the UK. So coming to the end, so just some closing thoughts. Okay, so this is both a business and an ethical issue. Obviously we're doing a lot of work here, but I can tell you, it from the people in my team, especially young people, when we have one of these jobs come, they all want to work on it because it's opened their eyes to the issues that not just here but around the world, and how people are being treated. So the people in my team like working on this because they like to help the others and see it. So it is an ethical issue, but it's also a business issue. And as I said at the outset, you can't treat this as a sustainability or an HR issue. You've got to treat this as a risk and compliance. And that's one of the things that came out from the US Customs visit here, is that we've had years and years of sustainable audits and all that, and they've become very tick box. Okay, so they want it more treated as a risk and governance issue to help address the problem. New Zealand does business with and invests in Asia, particularly China and Southeast Asia. You will have touch points, either directly, remotely, 2 or 3 people down the line, with companies that deal with manufacturing, have issues, have forced labor, or how do you satisfy yourself that they don't? Okay, many imports to New Zealand come from Asia, household brands, like I mentioned. There'll be this issue that we're just finishing now with another company. You will have a lot of people on this call will have product from that company, right? And the workers are paying fees under the table to come into Malaysia and manufacture that. The general awareness of the issue in New Zealand is not high. There are forced labor issues. I know it's been a topic there with a lot of in the service industry. I mentioned McDonald's with some of the Indian restaurants. The fishing fleet off the South Island has got some major issues. The horticultural industry, especially with backpackers and that not only here in New Zealand but also in Australia too. New Zealand is not immune. You know, Tito Phillip Field. I remember the late Tito Phillip Field, the former Pacific Island minister under Helen Clark's government. You know, what he was doing was essentially forced labor, bringing in Thai workers via Samoa, forcing them to be able to get a visa into New Zealand. He was making them paint and tile his houses in Samoa. And then if they did that, then he would help support the application with the immigration minister to get a visa into New Zealand. And also the use of labor from Pacific Islands and that, you know, so if you have clients, customers or whatever that are using Pacific Island labor that's coming from Pacific Islands, you know, how their treatment is, you know, are they paying under the table recruiting fees? Are they being put into debt bondage back in Tonga or Samoa or Fiji? Yeah? ESG and labor rights are becoming, you know, very topical for consumers and investor relations. You know, what are the commercial and reputational risks to you and your customers? You know, and especially if there's a WRO somewhere in the supply chain. Now, U.S. Customs is now getting hugely aggressive in this area for a number of reasons. One being, you know, this is a very topical issue, the issue of forced labor, modern day slavery, but also, you know, we have to acknowledge that the U.S. Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission have been writing a lot of publicity in recent years around some of their enforcement action for Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, etc. Huge, you know, AML issues, huge fines, huge deferred prosecution agreements, and U.S. Customs has been lagging behind. Okay, so there's a bit of a competitive infighting with other U.S. agencies, is saying, well, we've got this tool. Why don't we use it and get some publicity for ourselves? Now, one thing that the head of the US Customs, when he came out here, said is, this is only going to ramp up because unlike a lot of other issues, this has cross-party support, strong cross-party support. Doesn't matter if it's Trump, Biden supporters, whatever. Nobody is fighting enforcement of this in the US. They're only supporting it.
Alex, okay, how would an Sorry, Alex, how would an organization monitor these type of practices and incorporate that into their organization? Are there monitoring or detection practices, perhaps in a similar way to sanctions?
Yeah, so, I mean, I'm not selling our wares or whatever. You can go to anyone else, but we have a research team that does for clients ESG due diligence, third-party due diligence, quite sophisticated research. So that's one thing. You can get a provider to help you with doing that on your third-party chain. Also, what we're now getting is clients coming and saying, right, we've got an Australian client that said, we have a factory in that we use. It's not ours, a third-party agreement with a factory in Malaysia that manufactures our product for it. We have a right to audit and to be of that. So can you go in and do a labor rights, modern day slavery review of their thing and write the report for us? And part of our agreement with them is that we can have these going ahead. So those are those, we call it loosely audit. It's not a financial audit. Let's call it a labor rights audit. It's also making the company do it themselves and providing you with the report. It's also raising the awareness. I think, you know, a lot of people aren't aware of just how bad it can get. Now, not all companies. That VS Industry was fantastic. You know, our labor rights consultant said she's so proud of it. So some companies are good. We don't want to tie them all with the same brush, but you need to make sure. So if we come back to it, is doing the third-party due diligence around that. And secondly is doing actual labor rights reviews, labor rights audits, whatever you want to call it. But thirdly is also mapping out where is your risk, because what are the high risk industries, high risk sectors that you're operating. So just finally on that, one of the clients we have, it's a Fortune, it's in the top 20 of the world, Fortune. They take the view, because they have a treasury function, that if there's any forced labor, they take that as a predicate offense for money laundering. That's the view they're taking. It's not in law. So they will then decide whether or not to continue that relationship, because they say forced labor is a predicate offense. Financial institutions, big push here as to what role banks have to play in it, because they see both sides of the transaction. They bank the employer, they bank the worker. And what training do they give when the worker, to the bank staff when the worker comes in? 30 workers come in to open a bank account or withdraw their wages. Do they look in fear? Is the manager holding all their passports? Just things like that. I mean, we can go on. Okay, so that's my presentation. Any other questions? Happy to ask them. The next slide.
Should organisations be looking to perhaps then include modern slavery in their AML CFT policies and procedures? I guess in a similar way.
At the moment, it's not. Well, there are parts of it, there's parts of the law that impact modern slavery, like in Malaysia around minimum wage, housing, passports, all the rest of it. But some of it don't fall under the predicate offense for money laundering. But this particular company does. So they're taking a higher standard. They're a global company. They don't want to. So you can take that. You can take that view. But I think the thing for people on the call that maybe they want to do is to have a look at, well, where are our touch points? Where are our touch points? If you're an investment house or you're a bank, who do we loan to? What do they do? Because at some point someone's going to get caught. Okay, in New Zealand, this is just spreading like wildfire, the enforcement of this, and the reputational hit. If you're a bank and they'll say, actually, why have you got a relationship with company X? Why are you loaning them all this money to invest here? And they're bringing in product from this company here, and it's all made with Xinjiang product, or it's made from a factory in Cambodia or Malaysia they're treating their workers poorly. The reputational hit is enormous.
So do you think that organisations should look to, before New Zealand legislates in this space, do you think they should be looking to their parent companies, to other jurisdictions, to start incorporating policies and procedures, best practice into their organisations? Yeah,
the short answer is yes, because this here it's not just a risk, it's actually how we treat other human beings, okay? So we know that with legislative requirements takes years to go, or months to go through the parliament and all the rest of it. This is how it's actually treating people, So I think my personal view is, if it's not been done already, you should be, because you just don't want to be importing product or having ties to companies that treat people. And when you see it, they just treat people poor. I mean, that poor bugger on pumping petrol, he's scared witless because he saw some bloke thrown off the boat. Never going to find him again, and some of the stories that we're being involved in is terrible when we see it. But it's not everybody. Some companies are really good. They treat their workers well. They have great facilities. They look after them. They pay them well, and the workers are happy. Other ones, it's a disaster. But it's also household names, large companies, that have relationships with some of these manufacturing sites, which is just terrible. And so you're buying product made essentially with slave labor.
Well, that brings me on to another question in the chat. The WRO companies, is that list public?
Yep, you can go on to US. Just go and do a search for US Customs and Border Protection WRO, and it'll have it. It won't tell you what's under investigation at the moment, but there are a few. Most of it's in China, but it has a list, and it has all the old list as well. Who was on it and who's now being rescinded. They don't remove it. I can't remember what they call it, inactivated or something. But Top Glove came off it because U.S. Customs said they did a really good, and they have done a very good job. They've done they have 4 different whistleblowing channels. They have app-based training on human rights for all their workers, and that, because you see a lot of the workers, they live off their smartphone, because then they can FaceTime back to Bangladesh or whatever. So a lot of their training, Top Glove has invested in it as app-based. So it's really good stuff.
So time for one last question. What do you think we can do in New Zealand to grow awareness of this issue at an industry level, but also individuals?
Okay, so I think it's all around raising the awareness. So I think forums like this is good. I think it's also being aware and like I said, doing that mapping exercise of what industries are at risk and what industries you import from. We can't be just isolated in New Zealand. We're dealing with the rest of the world, but also I think engaging in that political process, because forced labor, as I understand, is a topic at the moment with the New Zealand government and is engaging with the political process and that. And I think New Zealand, to be fair, is a little bit behind the times, or a little bit. We're not up to it, because we like to think of everything being really nice, but it sometimes isn't. And it's all about raising the awareness.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. It's quite overwhelming how what is perceived as a global issue has a bigger impact on New Zealand than I think many of us will have realised. So thank you everyone who has listened in today. Today's webinar, along with all FSC Connect webinars and FSC conference sessions, are all available for viewing on YouTube, and keep a lookout for FSC emails for further upcoming FSC Connect sessions. And lastly, if you would like continued engagement with the FSC and peers on this topic and further ESG topics, we encourage you to join the newly formed FSC Climate and ESG Committee. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much, Alex, for your time.
Cheers, then. Take care. Bye-bye.